Hello gang, I hope all of you guys are doing alright and ready for another true crime story to get stuck into. Today I'm going to tell you about potentially, probably the most famous serial killer of all time. I don't even know why I've even given myself this challenge of doing it in 10 minutes, but this is somebody whose identity till this day remains a mystery. He killed 5 women in East London on a murder spree that lasted only 4 months, but his legacy has survived centuries. His name still sends shivers through us today. It's Jack the Ripper. Shwa-na-na-na, 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 shwa-na-na-na. It was this week in 1888 that Jack the Ripper claimed his second victim, Annie Chapman. Annie was 47 at the time of her murder and she lived in a lodging house in East London. Whilst by day she sold plastic flowers and did crochet work, it didn't afford her much in the way of income, so she supplemented her money with prostitution at night. And she was killed on September the 8th, 132 years ago this week. Let us set the scene of 1800s Whitechapel in London. It was a place that was viewed by citizens either with compassion or utter contempt. Despite it being an area where skilled immigrants, mainly Jewish and Russians, came to begin a new life and start businesses, this district was notorious for squalor, for violence and for crime. Prostitution was only illegal if it caused a public disturbance, and thousands of brothels in low-rent lodging houses provided sexual services during this time in the late 19th century. At the time, the death or the murder of a working girl was rarely reported to the press, and it wasn't discussed within polite society. This is before the Jack the Ripper spree. The reality was that ladies of the night, as they were called, were subject to physical attacks, which sometimes resulted in death because of their lifestyles. But it was the spree of Jack the Ripper and also what he did with the bodies of his victims that kind of changed this a little way. It didn't change the way that deaths of people who are sex workers are treated, as I go on to mention later in this video, but it definitely changed the way they were reported and discussed in the press. Jack the Ripper's spree began with Mary Ann Nichols. She was last seen just an hour before her body was discovered late in August 1888. Her throat had been cut twice, with one wound so deep that it severed the tissue down to her vertebrae. She had been stabbed twice in the vagina and her abdomen was ripped open. Annie Chapman, whose murder is the reason that I'm telling you this story today, was discovered at approximately 6 a.m. on September the 8th. She had 2 cuts to her throat, the same as Mary Ann, but the flesh from her stomach had been placed over her shoulder along with her intestines, and her autopsy revealed that parts of her vagina had been removed. She was last seen talking to a man by a witness who heard him ask Annie, "Will you?" And she said yes, but that man was never identified. The 3rd and the 4th victims were killed on the same day, September 30th, 1888. Elizabeth Stride was found with 1 wound, a cut to the throat, and that's it. It's believed that the Ripper either was disturbed before he was able to mutilate her body, or that she in fact is not a victim of him, but she is on the official list. 45 minutes after the body of Elizabeth was found, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found. Huge parts of her uterus were removed along with her kidney, and her face was disfigured. Even her eyes were cut. A lot of damage was done to her. And the last victim that is confirmed to be that of Jack the Ripper, and the only victim not found on the streets of East London, was Mary Jane Kelly. She was the final victim, and she was discovered on November the 9th. Her face had been hacked beyond all recognition. Her throat severed to the spine, her abdomen was emptied of most of its organs, and she was found in her bed at the lodging that she rented. Her breast, uterus and kidneys were found underneath her head, and her heart was just never recovered. All 5 killings attributed to Jack the Ripper took place within a mile of each other, in or near the Whitechapel district of London's East End, and every single victim was killed at night, with only Mary Jane not being on the street soliciting sex. The violence with each crime just got worse, and of course Mary Jane's one was a shit show. Whilst dozens of other murders were suspected of being the work of the Ripper, none have categorically been added to the official victims list. So even though Jack the Ripper only had 5 victims, 4 of which were within a month span of each other, because the notion of a serial killer was super rare back in the 1800s, and because of the violence that he has afforded to his victims, he is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Some bad news for this video: most of the files relating to the police investigation of this case, of the Jack the Ripper case, were destroyed during the Blitz. But what does exist is this. The police investigation included police doing door-to-door interviews throughout Whitechapel. There are more than 200 people interviewed, 300 investigated, and 80 detained. There was a £500 reward offered, which in today's money, roughly estimated is about 10k. Butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, physicians were all suspected because of the manner of the mutilations. I read somewhere something like 26 butchers were on the suspect list simply because they knew how to hack up a piece of meat. There was a volunteer committee created in which people would scout the streets of East London and be on a neighbourhood watch type of thing as well. But Jack the Ripper was never found. One of the craziest things about Jack the Ripper is his name. It was given to him by himself. A number of letters were allegedly sent from the killer to Scotland Yard, taunting officers about his gruesome activities and speculating on murders to come. The moniker, Jack the Ripper, originates from these letters. They might have been a hoax, but they were published at the time of the attacks. I would read these out to you, and I would get involved in them, and we would talk about it, but it's written centuries ago, and the language is so long. I've put a link if you fancy reading some of the letters in the language of the killer himself, potentially, but it's that olden English poetic way of talking. Did somebody say AQA? Did somebody say English GCSE? With all of the movies and walking tours and merch and TV shows and songs, it is easy to forget that 5 women, real life women, human beings, lost their lives to a serial killer in the 1800s, a man who was in fact never caught. A lot of serial killers and their crimes are romanticised, but none like Jack the Ripper. He picked the perfect victim as well, sex workers. Even though these crimes that I'm speaking about happened hundreds of years ago, it is notorious in the police, in investigating it, that crimes that involve sex workers are not taken seriously, and that is why they are one of the most targeted groups amongst serial offenders. You can't help but think that's part of the reason why this guy went completely uncaught. Theories though are endless. There are various theories about Jack the Ripper and his identity that have been produced over the last decades, over the last century. Claims including famous Victorian painter Walter Sickert, a Polish migrant, even a prince like a grandson of Queen Victoria, and since 1888 more than 100 suspects have been named, contributing to wild folklore, widespread ghoulish entertainment about the mystery. There's even a movie From Hell starring Johnny Depp, which is quite a good film actually. Recently though, in 2011, the conspiracy continued. British detective Trevor Marriott had long been investigating Jack the Ripper, the murders and his spree. It made headlines in 2011 when he was denied access to uncensored documents surrounding the case by the Met Police. According to the article that I read, that I'm going to link in the bio from ABC News, the London officers refused to give him the files because they included protected information about police informants that handing over the documents could impede the possibility of future testimony by modern day informants. Come on, these are murders in 1888. I very much doubt that the informant system is the same as it was back then, but there you have it. Till this day, we do not know who Jack the Ripper was. Was it the lead investigator in the case? Was it a doctor? Was it a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker? Was it Johnny Depp? We have no idea. And if you have any theories or thoughts on Jack the Ripper, let me know. Hopefully I've given you enough information in this video to at least tantalize some investigation on your part, and hopefully you've learned a little bit more about the serial killer whose name everybody knows, because this week 132 years ago, he killed Annie Chapman on the streets of East London. Thank you for watching the anniversary, and I will see you guys next week.